So, Jesse Levin, the credo of Soft and Savage is that there are those that are faced with challenges and there are those that seek challenges. And you are clearly a seeker because since you graduated from Babson College, which is the #1 undergraduate and graduate entrepreneurial business school in the world, you have been boots on the ground at natural and man-made disasters before the NGOs get there. You just finished spending 2.5 years in the Ukraine, and you are now the executive director of DEF, which is the Defense Entrepreneurial Forum, which I want to get to in great detail, but you've got great stories to tell. So, Jesse Levin, welcome to Soft and Savage.
Well, thanks for having me. Round 2, let's go.
Round 2. So you describe yourself as an expeditionary entrepreneur. And just if you can explain what it is that means through a number of the experiences that you've had, because you've done fascinating things. And I don't think people understand an entrepreneurial lens used to solve situations in austere environments. So if you could regale us with some of the stories about some of the.
Yeah. So expeditionary entrepreneurship is something that we've been developing since Panama in 2007, 2008. And the idea is essentially taking an entrepreneurial toolkit and a lens, looking at starting things in environments that are very resource constrained and very competitive and getting them done irrespective of the challenges. And that happens to be very applicable in austere environments, in war zones, and humanitarian disasters. So we've paired military special operations veterans, folks in the intelligence community, people who specialize in humanitarian assistance and disaster response and emergency economic stability, and created this capability that we call expeditionary entrepreneurship. And there's really 2 sides to it. One is domestically, when you look at launching a startup, and we've done a lot in the world of brick and mortars, where we've, tried to really creatively pair the national security community with the entrepreneurial community. And when you have to build capacity very quickly with not a lot of resources, it's the same exact approach you need to take when you drop into a disaster zone or a war zone and you don't know the culture or the language or the movers and shakers. The same way you kind of cultivate resources and build community is the same way you would essentially ostensibly go about launching a startup. So both sides of the coin is in the States. We've done that a lot with brick and mortars, anything from bars and climbing gyms and co-working spaces, to sending specialized teams into Haiti, the Philippines, Ukraine, Panama, you name it, to do really rapid capacity building and emergency economic stability and humanitarian assistance and disaster response work.
So give us some examples. Tell us about, what was the first one, Panama?
Yeah, we really learned, we kind of formed the thesis in Panama. 2007, 2008, there's still a lot. It was a lot more of a Wild West environment. There was a lot in parts of the country. There was a lot more drug running and activity going on back then in an area called Veraguas, Cocle Norte, Costa Arriba, Costa Abajo. There was mining activity, there was foreign direct investment, and there's obviously a lot of contested perspectives and objectives between those groups. And we got involved and we're basically, in a way, trying to keep people from killing each other while allowing everyone to kind of go about their own respective business. And during that time, there was a lot of flooding in the area, and there wasn't really any infrastructure where we were working. There was no roads, there was no electricity, there's no cellular phone coverage. There's these indigenous villages where you had the FARC who were running narcotics. You had a group called the Tumbadores who were out of Colón, who were basically Panamanian, I don't call them mafia, but gangsters who would go about stealing the drugs that the FARC would use and stash along the coastline with all the farmers and subsistence villagers. And then you had one anti-narcotics maritime police unit that would patrol something akin to 200 nautical miles of coastline with no radar, no radios or anything to that effect. And when there was a huge amount of flooding, we realized that no one really had the capability and capacity to do anything. These villagers were slammed in these riverhead villages. They couldn't get their boats out through the waves. And so we said, okay, well, if we go and we pay for fuel for the Marine Police unit, will you guys give us a ride and help us get to these villages? And they said, sure. And it was actually a really interesting time because irrespective, and this will sound very weird to most people, but when there's an emergency, it's actually a great opportunity to build collective community and capacity. And irrespective of differing norms or warring factions, a lot of times people will just come together because they want to help. And I know that sounds insane, but there were folks who were, previous members of FARC. There were, all kinds of people running around that coastline. I said, who just chipped in to say, hey, let's get this done. Let's help these people. And so we realized that, A, you can work with the institution, provide, funding for fuel to what is ostensibly a a national asset or a government asset, and you can go to the Red Cross Depot and say, hey, we're doing this thing, we need stuff, and they'll be like, sure, I'll take the stuff. And so you can take unconventional private capital, utilize NGO / government resources, and pair it all together very informally and very on the spot without any kind of contracting means whatsoever, just execute. And then when folks come together and they get to work in that capacity, they understand that they're just everyone's human, and they kind of have this more familiar, friendly rapport, which will carry back over into everyday life once the emergency is over.
Huh. So tell the story about, because didn't you have the drug runners boat that FARC were using to help you bring supplies in at one point? I know that you took cows out, which sounded very, very strange, but you were also using the drug runners boats to.
It wasn't no. We were using we teamed up with the anti-narcotics police unit, who had I don't know where they got that boat. It definitely looked very indicative of a boat used for nefarious activities. But yeah, we were riding with them, and we were just running relief operations, bringing supplies in, bringing sick people out. And a lot of times, you mentioned the cow story. In these incidences, there's a lot of these really deeply ingrained SOPs where these large organizations.
What's SOP?
Standard operating procedures, where the idea to help, we need to flood an area with water or food or clothes or what have you. And there's always, in these large-scale disasters, which this wasn't a very large-scale disaster, but, Haiti, the Philippines, there's these massive depots at these airports that fill up with stuff that's completely useless and doesn't get anywhere. And oftentimes what people really need is not part of the conversation. And we actually, the flooding was prolonged, and they were not only subsistence fishermen, but they were cattle farmers. And their cattle were getting stuck in various parts of the coast where they couldn't get access to it. So they asked us to help them move the cattle as part of like a critical emergency, operation, which we were happy to do. So we were hog-tying cattle and throwing them in the boat and moving them around. And that's where we learned about alternative currency, right? It's not just, money or things that people need. Oftentimes you have to really understand the cultural nuances to figure out what's impactful.
And, you made mention of the fact that there are oftentimes that all of the supplies that the NGOs bring in are brought to the ports, but they can't get them what you call last mile. And that really is your strategic brilliance, is getting things the last mile.
Yeah, I mean, there's this is not like an esoteric concept. Like there's a huge logistical bottleneck that typically occurs where we're great, the traditional aid institutions writ large are great at getting things to a point. And then, quote unquote, last mile, getting from the airport or the port to the population in need always proves to be far more difficult for any number of reasons. But even more than, trying to solve that problem, our approach has always been identifying and supporting hyper-local capacity to kind of eradicate or decrease the need of dependence on that external relief, because that's more palliative in nature. And, when there's a big event, a lot of times like life-saving aid is just needed. There's an acute period where you just need people to help, and food and water and shelter. But very quickly that transitions into kind of more of a recovery period. And the sooner you can get the local ecosystem, whether it's economic or otherwise, bolstered and up and running to solve their own challenges, you decrease that need on external aid, and you also decrease the ability for malign actors to come in and take advantage of the situation, which is, if you read any of like Naomi Klein's work, the shock doctrine, there's no question that disaster capitalism is very much alive and well. And our adversaries take advantage of these types of situations to build rapport and to gain entry into, from an influence perspective, into these various jurisdictions.
You have a great story about building native capacity when you went into Puerto Rico. Was it after a hurricane?
Puerto Rico's 2017 Hurricane Maria. I was invited down there. My buddy, Steve, who's kind of someone I do all the communications work with, was down there. Actually went down before the storm and said, hey, right after the storm hit, he called me and said, you need to get down here. There's just going to be a lot to do. So went down and met up with Steve, and we're just kind of kicking around for a day or two. And the first thing that we always try to do when we hit the ground is to figure out what's actually going on, right? And Puerto Rico was interesting because it was more emblematic of an international response, but because Puerto Rico is a U.S. protectorate, it fell under the auspices of FEMA. FEMA is not necessarily designed to handle more international environments, and there's also a tremendous amount of misconception as to what FEMA can do and what they're designed to do. FEMA in essence is really a funding and advisory agency to get behind local government resources and assets, and the only real direct action that they do is search and rescue. So you have these populations that are sitting and waiting for, to be saved by FEMA, but FEMA can only be as effective as the local government. And so if the local government does not have the assets or resources, they're really handicapped. And more detrimental to that is a misunderstanding of the populace of what FEMA is designed to do. So you've got these people waiting for help that simply isn't coming. And what was happening in Puerto Rico was the traditional aid ecosystem. And again, this is not to belittle or to naysay or any of this, but there was this perception that there's a huge lack of food and water, which in some cases was true. So you've got to remember the island was destroyed, the roads were destroyed, ports were really damaged. So getting anything off island, onto island, and then out to the damaged areas was incredibly difficult and costly. And a lot of the effort and resources were being directed to bringing in huge container ships full of palletized water and MREs, which are meals ready to eat, which if anybody who knows or has eaten those, no one wants them. And you eat those for 2 days and, you got a whole different type of emergency on your hands. And so we went out and, we basically had come to understand very quickly that in the very remote areas, we put a pin on the map, drove into the most remote area we could get to, had a chainsaw, whatever, and went out in the Jeep and started talking to these local owners of what are called pandarias, which are these local supermarkets. And they had all known the storm was coming. They had stocked up on a tremendous amount of food and water. They had generator, they had gas, and they were, of course, doing what they could to help their communities for a period. But, if there's no commerce and there's no way to kind of bring in money and you can't pay your people, like that starts to break down very quickly. And the real issue was not necessarily a lack of food and water as an example. Like if you had sent out a couple hydraulic engineers and welders, you could have fixed these pump houses and pipelines that would have taken care of entire municipalities, right? As opposed to having to ship in truckfuls of water and bottled water, which is a huge waste issue. And on top of that, a huge percentage, I don't remember the number anymore, of the people of Puerto Rico depend on EBT, or electronic benefits transfer, or food stamps. And if there's no power, there's no communications. And if there's no communications, there's no point of sale. So you couldn't run the cards to actually facilitate any kind of purchasing or selling. So the merchants were trying to support their communities, but they could no longer sell anything. They couldn't really buy anything. And they couldn't pay their people. And that was a really detrimental, acute food security breakdown and economic emergency.
And the FEMA trucks were parked right next to the bodegas. So.
In some instances,
Yeah.
yes. And they would say, hey, can you please stop doing this? We're trying to solve our own problem, and we've got the food. This is problematic. And so we cultivated relationships, and Steve had been down there, and he's great at networking, Steve Birnbaum, and we had a relationship with the CIO and CTO of Puerto Rico. And if it's amazing when you walk into these environments. Like FEMA has what's called a Joint Field JFO acronyms, like the Joint Field Operating Office, which is this huge thing they set up, and they bring in tons of people, and it's this logistically complex operation where you have what are called ESFs, which deal with ESF. They're clusters, and they deal with communications and sanitation and all these different things. And so you've got this war room of people, and we, because we were firefighters and because we knew someone, we could just walk in and we had realized that the real issue was not necessarily food and water, but it was connectivity. And if we could restore connectivity, we could restore economic commerce, and we could restore, solve the food security issue using local resources while reinvigorating the local economy and decreasing the need for external supply. And everyone's like, yeah, it's a great idea. Let's do that. That's amazing. That makes so much sense. But no one could fund it. You couldn't move it quick enough because it's government and it's slow. And again, that's not a knock. That's just a reality. And so, we swiped $30,000 on the credit card, and we met these guys that have this very simple, cheap satellite, these terminals, which are really, not sophisticated. And we went around and we worked with the Department of Family Services, who had all of the data for EBT transactions throughout the island, who could say, hey, these are the most prominent areas of the heaviest usage. And we went and, if these owners had a generator and had real food and supply, we'd connect them, put the satellite terminal on their roof, and then they're up and running. And within, we spent $30,000, and then, DHS and FEMA helped us fly around. They give us air support. Without them, we couldn't have done it as effectively. So it was a collaborative effort. And within a couple months, millions of dollars of transactions had gone through the system, which we just paid for. And, thank God, a local foundation, I don't remember the name of it, but they reimbursed us and said, hey, they focus on economic solvency and economic empowerment in Puerto Rico. So it was within their mission. So they wrote us a check and paid me back for the $30,000. So broke even on that one. And it was a great use case.
And Haiti?
Haiti, in what sense? What do you want to know about Haiti?
Well, in Haiti, I think that you were able to bridge the cultural divide with a sense of humor, and you were also able to because you didn't have to, you weren't part of a bureaucracy, and you didn't have the kinds of constraints that the bureaucracies have. You were able to do things, for instance, take the trucks out at night and
Sure, yeah. Haiti, 2010 Haiti earthquake. was right after I had left Panama, and went down there just to volunteer for search and rescue. Ended up working with a joint Latin American task force for about a week, just doing initial, looking for folks, and then realized that game was kind of over. Right at that point, you're doing body recovery. You're not, you're not. And someone, I think it was actually my dad's ex-wife, said, "Hey, there's this guy. His family's from Stanford. Here's his number. Call the sat phone." And so I literally walked with my bag from this site we were living at, the search and rescue operation up in Petchenville, and called this dude and said, "Hey, man, like someone said to call you. I'm here. If I can be helpful, like I'm happy to help." And he's like, "Yeah, okay, I'll be there in 20 minutes." And Mike Stewart pulled up with Skylar in a flatbed truck, and a year and a half went by, and he was in-country director for a tiny little NGO called Hope for Haiti, which had been there forever, and it's a small little operation, but it was like a 99% Haitian team, so it spoke the language, they understood how to move and operate, and you had all these larger NGOs down there who had these security posturing, regulations where they couldn't go out after night because it was dangerous, this, that, and the other thing. And because we were small and tiny, and there wasn't really a whole lot of bureaucracy, and we knew the environment, we could do things as were necessary to get it done. So that included driving around at night, and that included understanding where like the real needs and areas that were impacted were, and there's these instances of like these incredibly sophisticated field hospitals built in like these soccer stadiums that like the Haitians couldn't even get into because they're Haitian, and they had to be accompanied by it was the most bizarre thing. It was a really interesting learning experience, and I learned a lot about the disaster response world and logistics from Mike Stewart, who I've worked with now in various capacities for the past, over a decade. We're still working together on the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum. And then you mentioned humor. I think one of the most, important things I learned down there is a lot of folks will walk around in these environments, whether it's a war zone or a disaster zone, posturing as a form of security. So they'll walk around like this, like looking really like ominous and scary, and to kind of give them a wide berth. But our approach is always more like, put the hat on backwards, have a smile, like try to speak the language. And for the most part, in most parts of the world, and there's certainly exceptions, right? This is not to be naive. People are friendly and don't wish you harm, right? And it's not to say you can like go walk around, not City Soleil, Ciudad Sobeira, I'm getting my countries mixed up, but there's like, areas you can't go, and, you have to be cognizant, but oftentimes humor and empathy and like the ability to resonate with people will get you really far. Like I'll never forget Skylar, who was running Hope for Haiti. I think he's still running Hope for Haiti now. We were somewhere, and he spoke Creole really well, and he started like there's a gazillion kids around the truck, and he started singing this song, which was like basically like some like Creole, really not perverted, but like risky song, and all the kids were just laughing and thought it was hysterical, and everyone loved it. And there was one time when I was out at some point, a water drop, and I was down in Carrefour, which is by the port, and the truck got surrounded, and everyone was climbing up on the truck and shaking it, and like trying to get into the cab, and ostensibly that could be like a pretty nerve-wracking, dangerous situation. But on the other sense, like worst case scenario, you keep the windows, the doors, closed, and they steal stuff out of the back. That's still a form of distribution. But I rolled down the window, and I had always traveled with this like duck, this stuffed animal quacking duck. And I didn't speak any Creole. Not that I ever learned Creole, but I learned a couple of words. And I was like, "Como yes, ami?" Like the kid that stood up next to the door, and I took this duck out and went quack, 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 because it quacked. And he looked at me like, "Who the heck is this like white dude driving this truck in the middle of like this dump of an area with a quacking duck?" And like it just neutralized the whole situation. Everyone thought it was hysterical, and you just go from like terse and confrontational to like high five, what's up, like. And you can switch that, you can flip that switch very quickly.
So talk about switching, of flipping the switch. Next, you went to the Ukraine, which is not a disaster zone, it's a war zone. And you had a reputation of being small but mighty because of everything that you got accomplished there. So,
there's a lot happening between, Haiti and Ukraine. Ukraine was, Haiti was 2000, well, first time in Haiti was 2010, but Ukraine was the last major thing we did.
And we is Tactivate.
Is Tactivate, correct?
Yeah.
Like anything else, we don't look to contract. We just show up, and we see what we can do. And I had a great buddy who was a firefighter, a local firefighter that I worked with, who
in Connecticut,
who's Ukrainian. And I had another good friend through a veteran-centric incubator I'd been a part of, who was a sergeant major who had served in Ukraine for a number of years, and basically like literally hitchhiked over the border from Poland into Ukraine, it was a couple days after February 22nd when the kinetic activity restarted, because this has been going on since 2014, and very surreal. It was like the first couple of weeks was like pretty Mad Maxy, and didn't speak the language. I got in the back of this old Ukrainian dude's car, and then our buddy, this guy, the cousin of my firefighter friend, said, "Yeah, I'll pick you up at the border." I had no idea. I didn't know if my phone was going to work, but he had sent me a pin. And so we get 5 minutes past the border, and I just point to the guy who's driving and pull over. He's like, "Pull over." Like, okay. And he's like, "Yeah, we're going to get out." And we got out, and I was like, "Well, I don't see the guy here. Like, shit. Like, what are we doing?" And all of a sudden, this Tesla pulls up. I'd never been in a Tesla, and here I am in Ukraine, and it's like there's a million people trying to get out of the country, and we're going the other way, so there's nobody coming in. And there is this guy Julian pulls up in a Tesla, and he ends up being this crazy entrepreneur in Ukraine, and he takes us under his wing for the first couple of days, and we drive around with him, and then he takes me to this place in Lviv, which is very far west in Ukraine, and we meet another guy who was friends with Sergio, who had served in the army in Ukraine, and he turns out that this guy is just a monster of a logistician, has a logistics company that had worked with the DoD. So we were able very early on to establish a logistical and operational footprint with cross-border, capabilities and vehicles. And initially, we were just helping place. There are certain types of folks that had the right kind of skills. That because of our connections, we were connected with the MOD and various components of
MOD,
Ministry of Defense and GUR and these various groups, the intelligence groups within Ukraine, and we were able to help place folks from the U.S. with a certain set of skills to help them advise and to do those kind of things early on. And we were just running, basic stuff, medical kits and tourniquets. It wasn't anything really all that sophisticated. And then as we were leaving, we got asked, because we've been there for about a month and a half or something like that, and that's really as long as we can stay in things. We got asked to end up supporting this international company that happened to own a lot of local Ukrainian businesses to do what amounted eventually to a lot of emergency economic stability operations and trauma. We developed a whole trauma training program for staff, and we're responsible for 5,000 people. And it was a very interesting pairing of private capital in support of humanitarian and more kinetic operations, which would have typically fall under the auspices of State Department or DoD. And that's what was really interesting about Ukraine was the societal dynamic of it was a true whole of society response that people don't really talk about. Like everyone's really focused on drones and tech and electronic warfare, which is all important. But what's really missed, in our opinion, and what's really the most critical competitive advantage in the strategic aspect of this that we should be studying is what is it about Ukrainian society that enabled them to again flip the switch and really activate out of necessity to sustain and repel a far more resourced and larger adversary, right? It was a true, no kidding, I don't care who you were, a babushka, an entrepreneur, whatever kind of company, everyone is active in supporting the war effort. And this has nothing to do with a geopolitical or political perspective or whether we should be there or not, whether we should be supporting or not. Like humans are humans and there's always going to be conflict. And we really were interested in staying because we wanted to study that, right? We wanted to see, we wanted to help out obviously, but it was very interesting to watch how society congealed and what kind of capabilities and capacity came to be in regards to how they developed their drone technology in 24-hour cycles. And, a lot of those things, there's nuances behind that are worth studying, not just from a hardware perspective, but from a societal construct perspective.
And it seems like you've brought that back to your position as the executive director of DEF, and that you want to study that and implement that here in the United States through that entrepreneurial community.
Yeah, so DEF, or the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, is something I've been involved with for a very long time since it started. It's been around for 11 years. And it was started by an F-18 pilot and a Navy SEAL. And they wrote a white paper that was basically, the premise was, we weren't doing a very good job back then of identifying and empowering innovation from within the branches, within the forces, let alone from outside. And now, 10 years later, the ecosystem has very much evolved, and there's a lot in the world of innovation that's happening in national security and these programs of record, and there's a lot going on to work to ameliorate that deficit. And DEF has evolved, but what's really become is, because it's been around for so long, there's now very senior folks who are involved. Flag officers and general officers, which are kind of very senior folks in the military, and there's entrepreneurs and technologists and NGO folks and academics and tinkerers. Like, it's a very eclectic group. It's incredibly loosely organized. And you ask any two people that are involved with DEF what it is and what it means to them, they're going to give you like diametrically opposed answers, which is great because it's, they make it what they need it to be. It's referred to as a virtuous insurgency, and it is an all-volunteer NGO. And the net is like, we view informal networks as a strategic weapon system. So, while there's bureaucracy, and, we've honed our national security apparatus to thrive and be very successful in AOs, areas of operation like Iraq and Afghanistan, the geopolitical realities of today and the areas of operation in which we're potentially going to be getting involved with are very different. And our systems are anathema to the realities of the day, to include technology adoption, procurement, and there's a lot going on to improve and to tackle that. But in the meantime, we're engaged in real world activity, and what's been labeled as gray zone or gray area operations refers to, like, malign influence, cyber operations, mis and disinformation, economic coercion, logistical supply chain arbitrage. There's a lot that's happening that's considered gray, or almost falls under the banner of irregular warfare, which bifurcates it from the common conversation and makes it this like almost nebulous, esoteric thing. When in point of fact, like, that is the current war. That is, if you ask a lot of people, they say, yeah, well, we've been engaged in World War III for a number of years. And I'm not a fan of that lens, because when you look at things from through like we're actually engaged in kinetic warfare, which I think we are in a lot of ways, that puts us in a posturing where our only reaction is escalatory. Like, if we come at it from a competitive, we are engaged in war perspective, that's going to very much put linear parameters on how we respond, as opposed to like realizing and identifying and celebrating the fact that this is just evolved reality of the geopolitical landscape, and our adversaries are going to very much leverage our weaknesses. Like, we had our blinders on for 20 plus years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we didn't develop cognitive infrastructure or a really robust information, IW, or counter, information warfare capability and capacity. Not to say we're not doing it and trying, but we really are, quite frankly, behind the eight ball. And most frightening, and I think the most disadvantageous element of that notion today is that our true asset, and what I think our adversaries are most afraid of, is democracy, right? Is creativity, is the entrepreneurial capability and capacity of the American people. And when we started the global war on terror, like, there's literally a quote that says, what can the American populace do? And they were told quite literally to go shopping. They said, you can support the war effort by going shopping, which created this like monstrous decoupling of society's proximity to national security realities, which had incredibly detrimental effects, not only for like our relationship with veterans, but we really removed the general populace from the realities of what's going on geopolitically and the nature of warfare. And today we're doing the same thing, where this is almost as patronizing, to use your frame, your words a lot. You say a patriarchal, patronizing dynamic authority, or like the DoD. I don't think like intentionally, like, they want to protect the American people. And the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum is a really interesting counterbalance to that, in that it's a point of entry for folks who don't know they even necessarily have a role to play, or that they really want to get involved, but don't know how. And so it's a point of entry that's very welcoming. And rank doesn't matter, experience doesn't necessarily matter, as long as you have a positive attitude and you're willing to disrupt the status quo. You're more or less welcome to kind of join the ranks and join the organization. And what we're kind of combating is so much of the current effort, which again is important, but is so focused on hardware and software and technology and AI and compute, which is, again, all very, very important and necessary. But there's just de minimis resources and attention being paid to the human element, right? And we would argue, or I would argue, I can't speak for the organization on this part, that the American civilian, everyday person, you are the warfighter on the front line, because you are being manipulated by mis and disinformation on a daily basis, and don't have the skills or the perspective to acknowledge or identify that, or to cope with that effectively. We are in these trade wars, which are a very real reality that affects everyday life, like small business owners, teachers, the healthcare system. Everything is being consciously manipulated by our adversaries in ways that are so much more sophisticated and nuanced than the general populace realizes. And we're not having an honest conversation with the public. And what excites me about DEF is that it's a human-focused and human-centered and community-centered organization, right? Like I think, have the capacity and the ability to help remedy that disconnect and to change the conversation around getting people more involved in the national security ecosystem, not because we need to go to war and this, that, and the other thing, but because the capability and capacity to be of service was always a fundamental facet of American society, and we've lost that. Right? That doesn't mean we need to be prepared to go to war, but it means people need to have a vested interest and be involved and be capable of contributing. I think one of the reasons why I recommend mandatory travel is because I don't know what percentage of the U.S. population doesn't have a passport, but it's significant, and as a result, kids growing up do not have an appreciation for other cultures. So it's much easier for us to weaponize or to vilify others, right? So as opposed to these kids going to Mexico or Thailand, Philippines, or Chile, we can very easily manipulate the narrative and say these are others, they're enemies, they're what have you. And anybody who travels, for the most part, I made this comment earlier, people are amazing and they're welcoming, and irrespective of our misguided foreign policy, and people are willing to look past government action and to accept people on a person-to-person level. And so in that way, if we could get kids out of the U.S. and get them exposure to other cultures, it's very likely that they will just have a far more empathetic, appreciative perspective of life. And as they grow older and take positions of power, will look at things very differently and have just more of an appreciation and a celebration for the other versus viewing the other as an enemy. These others are my good buddies, and just because they speak a different language or that doesn't mean I can go and manipulate and take advantage of them. And so I think that's one reason, and the other part of it is just getting kids out and exposed to a different set of skills. It will change their perspective, whether that's the trades or again firefighting or EMS. We have to stop. For a very long time we've celebrated softer financial sector as the end all be all. We celebrate things that are odd, what people want to reach to be YouTube stars and sports players. Great, God bless, but we should be celebrating scientists and teachers and first responders and law enforcement and military personnel as the epitome of selflessness and what it means to be an American. The capability to be useful, not just to generate wealth, but to generate material impact for others. And I think a lot of folks would argue that the U.S. has lost its North Star. There's nothing really calling people to service. People don't know what to really rally behind. And
I think people have also been convinced that they don't have agency.
Sure. So those are things that we experiment with, at DEF and are actively working on addressing.
So what does it look like 5 years from now? What's the best possible case scenario, and what's your most frightening scenario?
If you put me in charge for a day, I would actually I just wrote about this morning. I would mandate and subsidize mandatory international travel for every American citizen between the age of 16 and 18. Huh. And I would require every high schooler to obtain an EMTB certification and a Firefighter 1 certification and serve for a year domestically. And I think that would help to bridge the socioeconomic and cultural divisiveness that we're experiencing here. I think that would change people's perspective and lens. That would give them agency, and that would help. It would help to provide a sense of a reality check, because when you work in those fields, your perspective and baseline shifts, and you become far less reactionary, and you become more proactive and calm and excited to be counted on to be a helper. So that's I think we need to focus far more on creative ways in the behavioral sciences arena to how to get and innovate around models to re-engage and activate civil society, and using the mechanisms that are in place, i.e. volunteer fire departments and EMS departments that exist. How can we make the capability and capacity to be of service attractive and sexy and cool and almost as an expected, right, to be an upstanding member of society.
And I think it would also assuage a lot of fear. I think that we're living in a very fear-based society because people, as you have always suggested, it doesn't matter if you've got the guns and you've got the food and you've got the water. You have to know how to do things, and you have to know the people in your community that are capable of doing the kinds of things that need to get done in an emergency situation, and that's not what we have going on now.
Yeah, I mean, people, it's funny to watch. I wouldn't consider myself a prepper, but we've done a lot in the readiness space, and the way that Americans, generally speaking, view preparedness is I'm going to buy a bunch of food and I'm going to stockpile ammunition, and I'm going to hide in my basement, and I need a bunker, and I'm going to isolate. It's like, it's not how the world works. Like anybody who's, served or has been in, and it's not to say, you don't need to be prepared. Like I'm not saying don't have supplies, but the mindset of like isolation versus leaning forward and being involved in building community and surrounding yourself with complementary, skill sets is imperative, because nothing happens in isolation. And I forget the guy's name.
Who wrote the book?
Yeah, he wrote the book Emergency. He was one of these like social, when you I forget what it's called, like social engineer dating, I forget. But anyway, he wrote a book, and the premise at first was he was terrified and did all these exercises of like, how long can I turn the power off in my house and live? And I bought the composting toilet, and I got MREs, and I took shooting classes, and he was preparing to be like, this like Rambo dude. And by the end of the book, what he came to realize is like the safest and the most like, secure he felt is by actually, as opposed to preparing to leave the system that he thought was out to get him, he became a part of that system. He became an EMT. I think he joined law enforcement. And it was like, oh, like these are my people. Like, oh, community. Oh, that's what it is. It's not about isolation. It's about joining and leaning in. So we have to really change the narrative. Because this current state is a very we versus they, isolation versus collective paradigm, which is just counter to the way the world actually works and what will be effective. And not to be a doomsdayer guy, but like the likelihood of something material happening, because everyone who's in the industry or in the national security arena, our adversaries have been in our systems for forever, for 15 years, 20 years. Like they are in our power grids. They are in our water systems. They are like. It's not that we're vulnerable and it's coming. They're deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched and ingrained, and all they have to do is flip a switch, right? And it's they're not going to invade the U.S. Like they're not going to drop a bomb on us. Mostly, they're not coming with tanks, but it's going to be economic. It's going to be cyber, and because we're so divisive domestically, it won't take a lot to get us to turn against one another. And anybody who's gone to a Home Depot after like Hurricane Sandy, like 2 days after, and watched the fistfights in the parking lot over the last generator, like. We're not accustomed to, when I was in Puerto Rico, there's some parts of the island where people didn't have power for 6 months. And they were sitting on their stoop, drinking beer, laughing. They had figured out how to take their car battery and like backfill their panel to power their house. Like we don't have that culture here. Like we're so used to being comfortable, and we've become very complacent, and we've become very entitled. So when we experience those disruptions, it's far more jarring, and we automatically revert to like, me, I am my own, versus, okay, this is time to go out and take care of the community. And that will, if we don't shift that will be a tremendous chink in our armor.
Well, all I can say is that I'm glad that someone with your experience and your mindset and your eloquence is changing the paradigm and getting the social fabric involved in protecting our country and ourselves. So Jesse Levin, thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me.
If you liked our show today, please like and subscribe. And thank you very much for joining us on Soft and Savage.